I am Grace Chamolu, and I'm joined by my colleague Julia Pornelia. And thank you all for joining us for this edition of PMF Connect session. Goes at the moment. If you were unable to make our last one, we had heard feedback from the PMF festival where people wanted to hear more from their colleagues and wanted to keep the connections with with the speakers that we had. And we wanted to be able to provide a way to continue that. And so what we did was help keep up the conversations through PMF Connect sessions. So if you weren't able to join us last time, what we were doing is providing on a monthly basis, a guest host will provide us with their thoughts on a particular topic for a few moments, and then we'll open it up for an AMA, an Ask Me Anything type of session. So you can send in your questions via the chat window at any time during the session. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and introduce you to our host today. Nabil was a speaker at PMF 2017 and is currently the COO of Status, a mobile OS for Ethereum. Most recently, he was lead product manager for Google Flights and is based in Zurich. Nabil joined Google Australia in 2010, and he led the team working on advertising solutions within Google Maps. Prior to Google, Nabil was an entrepreneur working in the online advertising space. He started Triana Global, the first online social advertising network, and led the business to its acquisition by Shopit in Los Angeles. Nabil also co-founded ADZ, a real-time advertising campaign for Asia based in Singapore. Nabil received his BS in telecommunications engineering from the University of Wollongong in Australia. So with that, I'll go ahead and turn it over to Nabil.
Okay, perfect. Thank you very much, Grace. So before we get into the questions, I wanted to quickly share a brief summary, like a 3 to 5 minute summary of the presentation from a couple months ago at PMF 2017. So hopefully that's coming through fine. Basically, the premise for the presentation is around group-based decision-making. So how can you, as a group and as a team, make better decisions together? And as a product manager, you often are in a room with a lot of other stakeholders, whether they're senior leadership or designers or engineers or someone else. And it's often not the case that you're the sole decision maker. So the presentation is proposing a framework of 5 simple steps. Well, not simple, but 5 steps to make it easier for you to make decisions together as a group. To start off with, let's quickly look at what the origins of decision making are. So the idea of a top-down or a general kind of at the top of an army.
I have a question, Nabil. This is Julia.
Yeah.
Before you even start, because I was in the room during PMF when you had your presentation, and it was a fantastic one, and I think the feedback we got was really amazing. And I loved your metaphor with the
Greece. Yeah.
Yes. Are you gonna share?
No, I wasn't. I cut that out. But if
it was really good. It was really good. So
okay, I can. Let me. If that's the case, then let me quickly pull up the other one, because I don't know. I haven't timed doing the other one, but I'll just pull it up and I'll try and move through it quickly.
I think it was a very good mix of history, and because we're often thinking about product management like it's something which has been around just recently nowadays, but then you realize decision making and things which product managers are doing have been around for way longer. So then that's what I was in the room when he did this presentation, and our viewers are gonna hear it soon. I was in the room and I was like, wow, I never thought about it like that, but this is such an inspiring example.
Okay, So 1 second, I think it's all up right now. Okay, so let's see how we go. So let's start again. So it's so ignore everything I said. Basically, imagine it's 700 BC, and you're in Athens, okay, and you're in the city, and then all of a sudden there is an attack led by the Persians. The Persian king Xerxes is coming across the Aegean Sea and is about to take over Athens. So this is a matter of life and death. The emperor has asked to get everyone in the room together, and you need to decide, what are you going to do? So there's people coming across the sea, and they're going to attack your city, and you need to figure out how to defend yourselves. So you are the supposed product manager of Athens, even though probably there wasn't one, but let's assume you are. What would you do in this situation? How would you get started to deal with so many different people, so many different opinions, etc.?
And this is a life and death situation. It's not like
exactly. So there's a lot at stake here. So all right, I'm gonna quickly jump through this. So let's make this a little bit more tangible. Let's say you're a PM for a furniture manufacturing company, right? And you're deciding between augmented reality and virtual reality. How do you decide which direction to go in? I'm assuming you have engineers that are built on both platforms. You have designers that have opinions. You have CEOs and other executives that have other decisions. This is a very real world example. Today you could be at a company trying to decide between one of these two. So these decisions happen every day. So now going back, the origins of decision making, it's helpful to understand this before we think about how we make decisions now in businesses. So in the military, 100 years ago, you had people, foot soldiers on the ground. They would get all the information and then funnel up the food chain until they get to the general. The general would absorb all the information and say, okay, now that I know everything, I will decide on X. And then that would flow back down the decision chain. And the reason why that happened was practical, is that not everyone knew all the bits of information. There was only the people at the top that knew it, and they could make the decisions, and you had top-down hierarchy. And the same terms used like a general are now used in companies called a general manager. So the military hierarchy just moved into the corporate hierarchy, and it's pretty much exactly the same thing. So decision-making, top-down decision-making, as people call it in companies, really is a legacy of military times. So this then leads us to, what do we do as product managers when we live in a different world? Most of us are working in tech companies. You have all the information. It's very hard to make, you're not at the top to make top-down decisions, but as product managers, our role is to make decisions. So what is a framework for us to make decisions together as a group? This leads us to the 5 practical guides for group decision-making. This is not a go 1 through 5 and tick all the boxes and you'll be great. Think of this more as like a very loose set of ideas or principles for you to go by. And then by the end of it, hopefully you're in a better place than when you were without them. So this isn't a magic 5 steps, but hopefully it should be a good guide. So briefly, you have collective wisdom, which is bringing all the data together. Ideation, which is coming up with the idea. Removing you, which is detaching your ego and making sure that the ideas are the groups and not your own. Reaching decision, and then shared responsibility. So I will try and power through these. So collective wisdom, most of the PMs who are in tech companies should know this quite well. This is your metrics, all the data you're bringing in. And also, what is the decision you're making? You'd be surprised at how many times people sit in a room or in a meeting for an hour and people are talking about 2 completely different things or deciding on different things. So make sure everyone is at the same level, everyone has all the relevant data, and that people are all on the same page. There are some examples, but I'm just going to quickly skip through them. So we have, next step is ideation. Now this is making sure all the known solutions are being brought to the table. So whether if it's obvious, these are the 3 directions we can go in, make sure they're articulated. If it's, if you don't have a solution, then you can, brainstorm. And there's many different brainstorming techniques. This presentation doesn't cover any of them, but then, the second step is really about coming up with your ideas and sharing them. Then we go into the more unique element of the framework, which is removing you. So let's say you have all these ideas you came out with in part 2 in ideation. Once they're given to the group, they're now owned by the group. They're no longer, it's not my idea, it's not your idea, it's the group's idea. And what this does is this removes people's egos from the decision-making process. So you get a lot more objectivity. Now this requires a lot of trust. This requires people to basically say, okay, I'm not attached to my own idea. Even though my ideas are clearly the best, I'm not attached to it, and it's now the group's idea. So this is really hard. And if you're a facilitator, one way you can help is by saying things like, instead of saying last week I said, or Jennifer's idea was really great, use we language or our language. So I think we came up with a list of great ideas. This idea that we came up with that's on the post-it note on the whiteboard is great, and we came up with it. This isn't Peter's post-it. This is our post-it. So it's really it's a very unique part of, I guess, the process. But if you get it right, it really makes the rest of the process much easier, and it removes a lot of kind of the politics or the stress or the tension in the decision-making process.
I have a question, because to me this sounds, on one side, it sounds really good. On the other side, like my individual self says, like, sometimes when I have ideas, I kind of want them to be acknowledged as being mine, as long as they're good. Maybe when they're bad, not necessarily. So it all sounds really great theoretically. Have you been in a team where this has been actually?
Yeah. So I mean, so once again, assuming the team incentives are correct. So if obviously people are compensated based on the value of their ideas individually, that's a difficult thing to decouple. But if a team is success or failure is based on the output of a given team, then incentives would be aligned in that case. So if you're, for example, doing annual planning and you're all sitting around in a room and saying, what are we going to do next year as a team for us to reach goal X? Right? We want to double the number of users we have. It doesn't matter who comes up with the best idea, as long as the idea is going to allow for doubling of users. And that's pretty much most of the annual planning or brainstorming sessions that I try to be involved in. We make sure that we don't identify individuals as being the source of great ideas in the sessions.
And so you're saying it has worked?
Oh, right. Yes. Yes.
I'm just curious because I think in general people have a hard time to remove the personal aspects from work.
I mean, you also set the example as well, right?
Mm-hmm.
You make sure you don't identify any of your ideas when you're sending out really practical things. Like if you're sending out meeting notes of like, these are all the things we came up with, don't put anyone's name on it, and then be very clear, this is what the team came up with. And you instill that identity of team decision-making when you have your list of ideas and when you're thinking about who brought what to the table. So, I mean, I've used it, and I think it's really effective, and it creates like a strong bond, especially between like the engineering managers, the product managers, and the designers as well, who are all kind of most likely the ones bought into whatever you're planning or you're brainstorming. Okay, so let's move on to the final one, which is, sorry, the fourth one, which is actually making a decision. So this is where your role changes from, from ideation to really being a strong facilitator. So you have to make sure that all the relevant stakeholders are heard. This is a very easy way where if steps 2 and 3 haven't worked out well, step 4, you could just get people who are, quiet and passive aggressive and just sort of stay silent. And in the moment, the meeting finishes, they leave and go do something else. So you want to make sure that everyone is very vocal. If people have strong opinions or opinions about things, make sure it's heard. So, once again, trust is very important here. If you see people who are kind of disengaged, call them out and be like, hey, is there anything, do you have any thoughts? Do you have anything you want to bring up? And be very tactful in the way that you approach that, but at the same time, make sure that people are super honest about the ideas and their thoughts about the decision. You need to make sure you bring like the goals that you set in the very first place in step 1. These are the goals that we have, and then make sure everyone's kind of in agreement on what you come up with. And then one really good example of taking this to the next step is Amazon. So they have this idea of disagree and commit that Jeff Bezos kind of coined. I think it's super powerful in this context. So even if there's an idea that you disagree with, or it wasn't your idea or whatever, if the team or group comes up with idea, pretty much all agrees, disagree and commit is an awesome way you can move forward and unlock. So it's like, what, I don't think this is the best option, but I'm committed to the option. And I think let's give it a shot. As long as, if you have the metrics from step 1 and the rest of the steps have gone through, and even in your gut feeling is no, disagree and commit kind of is a great unblocker. And there's a lot of, cool stories that Bezos comes up with and he shared, and you can look it up about the value and power of disagree and commit.
We have a question from Aurelian. He's asking regarding the decision session in terms of facilitating it. Is can you at the same time be the product manager and the session facilitator? Because he personally finds it hard to be facilitating the meeting and also bringing ideas to the table. Should these be different roles, or?
That's a very good question. If you have the resources for you to be different roles, and if you think that normally, I mean, from my experience, you've thought about a lot of this stuff beforehand, and so it's you already have had an influence on a lot of the other parts of the kind of decision-making process. But if you feel like you really want to be part of the discussion, then bringing in an external facilitator or asking someone who's not on the team to facilitate. Or, I found that a lot of good UXR user researchers are great at facilitating this type of discussion. So that is another option. I guess this is, for me, it's more a personal preference of being able to facilitate, just so that, you're closest to all the people in the room. You're familiar with all the decision making and the personality. So it makes it much easier for you to kind of navigate any potential pitfalls or people who have certain personality traits. You're aware of it, and you want to make sure that, their voices are heard, or you can kind of make sure the discussion stays objective. But I guess it's on a team by team basis.
Cool, thank you.
They're heard, or you can kind of make sure that. Oh, sorry, I was hearing my own feedback. Okay, so finally we have shared responsibility. So this is when you all leave the room, and you've already disagreed and committed, and then a week goes by and you're sitting around and saying, well, actually, I thought it was a terrible idea. Everyone else thought it was good, and that's why the project has failed. So what you really want to make sure is that everyone's bought in, everyone's responsible, and if things don't work out, it makes it much easier for you to kind of, if everyone's aligned and everyone agrees on what the initial metrics were, no one is to blame, and you want, like, part of building trust in the process is having shared responsibility at the end of it. And then I guess by having this shared responsibility, it makes it much easier for you to make, when you make future decisions with the same group, people are going to trust you further down in the rest of the process. And then this then leads us back to the shared responsibility for the attack that's coming from across the Aegean Sea. So basically, this was 800 BC. So for those that are new, we were talking about the Persians are attacking Athens, and you're in Athens. There's been a big, council meeting called, and there are 5 steps that you now need to go through to decide whether or not you're going to survive this attack. So first of all, you have collective wisdom. So according to history, what actually happened was a group of citizens continuously brought in news from the sea and from land, informing the council about what actually was going on, and where the ships were, how many ships, that kind of stuff. Secondly, the incentives were, second is ideation. And then obviously, how do you align all the incentives? How do you make sure that everyone is on the same page, coming with the same ideas? Third, you have removing you, which is the ego part. Now, there's no guarantee that Heracles, who's like the hero of the story, actually removed his ego, but let's assume for the case, for this example, he did. Then you have reaching a decision. So obviously there was a time pressure in making sure everyone got on the same page. The ships were coming, they were going to attack, and you have a time limit. And then finally, shared responsibility. So once you make a decision about what you're going to do, everyone needs to implement it. Otherwise, it's going to be a completely mismanaged defense of the city, and most likely everyone will die. So surprisingly, they come with a very intuitive idea of kind of doing like a reverse Trojan horse. So everyone left the city, which required a lot of trust and shared responsibility. The Persians came in, entered the city, was completely empty, and then they attacked. Then the Athenians attacked from the outside and kind of ambushed them. So this is a kind of a non-military, non-hierarchical decision-making process that the Athenians took in defending their city. Anyway, that was a little bit rusty, but hopefully that kind of gives a quick overview of the presentation. And now we can open up to Q&A.
Thank you, Nabil. I'll remind everyone that you can go ahead and send in questions from your chat window, and we can relay them to Nabil. In the meantime, Nabil, can you give us some tips on getting a recalcitrant or uncooperative team member on board, especially when they're a really important stakeholder? And I know you've been mentioning trust is a really big one, but we can talk maybe about if it's because of a lack of trust versus just they agree with things. But I think it would be really helpful to hear some tips on how you've found some success around getting someone to come on board.
So like a difficult team member?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So I think depending on what part of the process people are challenging, what I found is that if there's only a very small minority of people who are difficult, then the culture of the rest of the team can influence that. And obviously, if that's not the case, then what I've done in the past is actually gone through these steps individually with that person, not in like a okay, step 1, we are now going to do this, step 2, but more in terms of, there's must be an underlying reason that this person is being difficult, whether it's like wanting to have power over the decisions, just wanting to drag their feet because they're being passive aggressive for whatever reason. So, you can then frame a lot of things like the first step of bringing all the data to the table, sending them a direct email being like, hey, we've done all this research, here are all the numbers, let me know if you have any questions. And then step 2, hey, here are some ideas, which one of these do you think are most impactful? And doing it on a one-on-one basis basically disarms them from being passive aggressive in a big group. So I found that as a solution to this. So, if there's 10 people, this one person will either, nag on every idea and just kind of hate on it. And it's very difficult to have sessions with them. So instead, you break it up into artificial smaller teams, and then you have it's obviously a lot more work, but that's the reality. So you then have you have very specific sessions with that one individual, just to kind of make sure that they feel like they're getting preferential treatment for whatever reason, but they're still involved in the process, and you do your best to make sure that their ideas are being heard, but then they hear what everyone else's output is. And so you need to kind of simulate this environment. It's definitely not easy.
For sure. Not when you're dealing with people's egos, for sure.
Yeah.
We have some other questions here on the chat. So one of them, again from Aurelian, is regarding metrics gathering.
Yeah.
How can you best figure out what data do you actually need? So just sometimes you think you have all the required data. The question is, what do you actually need? Maybe it's too much, maybe it's too less.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I find, I guess, even before you go into the first step is like agreeing on key success metrics. And this is, slightly outside the decision-making realm, but at least personally, I like to prioritize metrics. So let's say you have 3 metrics that are your most important. You have one like North Star metric, you then have 3 metrics that are the most important, and then you potentially have a lot of others that are there. And I think even one part of the decision-making is like agreeing on what these metrics are, which you potentially do in a separate session. So let's say if you're doing annual planning and you don't even know what your key metrics are, you need to have a separate decision-making process about what are your key metrics for the product. So that will require, do we want daily active users? Do we want monthly active users? Do we want transacting users? Do we want to increase retention? Like what is the most important thing we have for the product? And that's something you probably need to do yourself with like, your CEO or whatever. I mean, it's a critical part of your business. And then once you have those, your North Star, your top 3 metrics and whatever else, then those are the ones you bring to the table.
And what if during the discussion you have with the stakeholder or the team, you realize that like you're missing some information?
Yeah. So if you don't have the right metrics, then just to be clear as well, like the 5-step process aren't like 1 meeting, 2nd meeting, 3rd meeting. The first step could just be like an email, and then a back and forth about like, what about this, what about that? And then you come up with like, oh, these are the metrics that we're missing, or here's an important piece of information. Then you have like your market level data, which is like, okay, how big is this industry growing? What is the number? Like, there's just a lot of things that potentially would be interesting. You want to make sure you bring to the table. But I think the important part of that step is making sure that everyone is aware of what the key metrics are, because a common problem that I have, for example, is I'll read some articles and think about a few things, look at some dashboards, and then in my mind it's so obvious that like this is the most important thing, but I realize that I haven't actually shared the dashboard or shared any of the numbers with anyone else in the room. So that's why it's more about, okay, if this is the 10 most important things to share, make sure every single person is aware of what those 10 things are.
Cool. And I think at the end, I mean, this is ongoing work. You always probably need to change or adapt. So I would say nobody can be perfect from the first meeting or reporting meeting. And then you just need to share it with others and then learn and then go back. And if you need additional numbers, just dig into that. Probably, I mean, for example, we change our KPIs depending on if it's the right number or not. We have a hypothesis, we start from that, and then if we realize something isn't really useful, just push it off the table and then see if there's an additional number. Cool. We have another question. So Condora asks you if you have experienced role changes, and specifically she has a situation where person A was a product manager but isn't anymore. However, this person is still on the team, and then there's a new person B who's the new product manager and has a hard time because they are envious. So this is leading to
person B or A?
Person B. So person A was the PM. They're no longer the PM, but still on the team. And now new PM, person B, has a hard time to no, actually probably you're right, the other way around. So it's has a hard time due to the envy of the other person A.
Oh, the new person. So the
Yes.
old person doesn't like the new person because they're doing
it exactly. So
how this is very similar to the first one. So basically, you've got someone who's like a bad actor in your process, who's like just being difficult for the sake of being difficult, and your job assuming no organizational changes can happen to remove this person from your day to day, you basically you should work with them one-on-one and be like, okay, so, like what are your ideas? What would you do if you were in my shoes? Right? And then, here are the 5 options. Which one do you think is best? Basically you would have to work one-on-one with that person and remove them from the group, because if you bring them into the group environment, it could end up becoming quite toxic. I mean, if you could do that if you have to, but then you would also make sure that you would you have to deal with it one-on-one. I mean, that's I guess how I would address it, is making sure that you're making them feel like they're heavily involved in the process, and then when you have the group meetings, hopefully you've addressed some of the concerns and the frustrations that person A had, and they won't be as disruptive.
Do you think direct open discussion might work in these cases, or?
I mean, in a big group, probably not, considering the circumstances. But maybe one-on-one, it might work. Basically, asking them if since person B is new to the team, would it be possible for them to kind of take ownership of this process? And that person A can constantly give feedback, but it would be good to help person B if person A could just stay out of it. And then, person B then needs to go out of their way to make sure that person A is updated and included, so that person A doesn't sabotage the whole thing.
I have a question from my side. So, Nabil, you've been at Google for how many years?
Yeah, for around 7 years.
7 years, wow! And right now you've jumped the ship to do your own thing. How does that work? I mean, how do you get such a courage? Because leaving Google, I bet, is not easy.
Yeah, so that's, I guess, a plug to the new company that I've joined. It's basically we're a mobile operating system, basically a mobile app for Ethereum. So it's definitely in the crypto space. It's a very unique opportunity, and the space is developing in a way that, in my mind, looks like what the internet was in like the mid-90s. So it's taking a lot of parallels. You have the crazy amount of investment from a .com perspective. You have the huge focus on infrastructure and protocols, which is what the entire, you have browsers that are starting from scratch, which is very similar to how it was in 94, 95 with Netscape and IE. There's a lot of parallels between these two industries, the blockchain space and the kind of internet formation.
Is it something you're personally passionate about? Or?
I mean, I think from a technology perspective, I see it as I see this as if I were to join Android in 2004 or join Netscape in 1994. It's like there's this new piece of technology that's going to slowly take over and the goal is, and I think the idea and the momentum is, that it will replace some critical parts of the internet in 3 to 5 years. So there is this decade-based shifts of technology and of how people interact. So from a career perspective, I wanted to be there early, and it is. I agree. It is risky and potentially not something that you know, maybe I wouldn't have done it if I had only been at Google for 1 or 2 years, but you know, the opportunity was exciting. I'm learning a lot, and the space is incredibly fast paced. And my pre-Google experience was all in the startup world, and Google was getting to a size that I was really craving the fast paced environment.
The risks.
Yeah, the risks, the speed, the yeah, everything, the lack of
bureaucracy.
Yeah. You know, you make a decision in the morning and then you start something in the afternoon type thing. Yeah.
Well, good luck and keep us updated how it's going. And so everybody who's watching, take it as a piece of advice. If you have as well opportunities in this space.
We have like 20 open roles. So I'll, you know, nice little plug there.
So Nabil, do you feel like when it comes to startup environment or even, you know, smaller versus larger corporate culture and size, do you feel like the 5 steps of decision making, or just how your this decision making process, how does it get affected or impacted as you?
So I think companies? So from, you know, just joining a startup and trying to go through this process, I feel like the personalities are exactly the same and behaviors are identical, but the number of people involved is lower. That's all. So instead of having 8 to 10 people in a room, you have 4 or 5. But the types of discussions and the people elements are all exactly the same. Like designers are designers, product managers are product managers, engineers are engineers, and you end up with very similar types of discussions and similar personalities. Yeah, the only difference is the number of people involved are much lower. So at a big company like Google, and you want to do something that's major, your decision making is going to involve, I don't know, like, you know, 3 steps vertically and maybe 3 to 4 people horizontally. So you're talking maybe like 12 to 20 people. Whereas at a startup, you're talking like 5 or 3 to 5. But the process and the dynamic and the part doesn't change. So it's definitely, in a startup, it's definitely it all happens in a much shorter amount of time. And it can, but the challenges are almost the same, because they're, I guess, yeah, it's people challenges. It's not, you know, it's not process related. I don't know. That's just my early take.
Okay. Do you feel like there's also any, when it comes to, you were mentioning a toxic impact when it comes to maybe a bad egg. So in terms of the impact of, you know, someone who's a little bit more toxic to the environment, impacting when it comes to a smaller group of people who are making decisions versus a larger one, do you feel the same way, that you just still need to help maybe keep that person off to the side a little bit, and you try to work with them more one-on-one still? It doesn't really matter the size of the team, still having them try not to get...
It's actually it's exactly the same. If there's still some people who are opinionated, who really have strong opinions, then you deal with them on a one-on-one basis. It's interesting. At Status, we are a completely decentralized team, so all communication happens through Slack. There's some video conferences, more just like weekly syncs, but all meetings are like, there's no meetings. Everything happens asynchronously on Slack, or synchronously if people are online at the same time. So we're in this really unique, you know, so everything that I'm kind of going through with the steps or decision making happens through Slack. So you know, if you need to deal with people one-on-one, you do that. And then you make decisions as a group, and then everyone gets together and you write a doc, and then people comment on the doc. So it's all the same things that are happening. It's just happening in a completely different medium. You don't all sit around with a whiteboard. It's all through Slack. But the principles and ideas are the same. You're like, okay, what are the key metrics we're measuring? You know, here are all the ideas. Maybe we vote on them, because we can't, like, it's very hard to discuss. We'll have a half-an-hour meeting. and then we're done, and then we share it with the rest of the team, and this is our decision. And that all happens majority through Slack and then like a little bit of video conference. But it's a very different medium, same process.
Great. Okay. We have let me just try to get from Harry. He says that it seems that your assumption is somehow that if all stakeholders have the same information, then all would take the same decision.
Mm-hmm. No, I disagree. That's not correct.
Oh, actually,
that's an excellent question.
Sorry, I will. He wrote in a couple of blocks.
Okay,
so to be fair to him, let me go ahead and I'll make sure I complete it. But that's not often the case in larger companies with different teams and budgets and different goals. For example, good idea. I agree we should do this, but not on my budget. The disagree and commit doesn't always work. Different teams really have different goals and KPIs in larger companies. So in these cases, as PM, you are back to having to convince higher management levels to align the different goals and force commitment. Any thoughts or hints at this? How do things work at Google?
Yeah, that is a very good question. I mean, I guess the part that I was disagreeing about was that if with all the same data, you don't end up it can still be very subjective. So that's definitely the case. Yeah, disagree and commit does have a big part of that. At Google, there was a very open, a very non-threatening escalation process if teams really got into a bottleneck and you couldn't make decisions. That normally happened when you had way too many people and too many bad actors, and it happened for people who have a lot of history together, people who've been working together for like 10, 15 years. So they would, you would go through this process, you'd come with an idea, and the PMs and the designers and the engineers who were working on the teams all in agreement, like this is the plan. And then eventually, as it goes through more and more senior management, things would start to get stuck, and then you talk about budgets or headcount or all these kinds of things, and then people can't agree, and then it gets escalated to the VP, and then this happens, and the whole thing breaks down. Now, I attribute that to the fact that not everyone implements this process, but assuming that that's not the case, we can, it's sometimes, yeah, things don't work out, and I have to say that even if you come up ignoring the 5 steps, even if your team is perfectly aligned, everyone does exactly kind of what they're supposed to do, and your decision making is processed, and your meetings go flawlessly. You have like this is our plan. This is what we're going to do. This is the budget we need. You're kind of the PM for your individual team. If there are people external who are holding the purse strings or controlling headcount that are outside of your control, that are wanting to make life difficult, that is much more like an organizational structural issues that, it's, there is like managing up or trying to influence the organization, but to some extent, like that's beyond these 5 steps, and it's on a per company basis as well, how you can do that. So I completely agree. Let's say if you have a team, you come up with the right decision, there's many ways that the whole thing could just get hijacked for whatever reason through ways that are outside your control.
I think so. We're discussing about difficult personalities, and for sure, often there are people, unfortunately, with whom you don't get along. But I would say there are situations where people just have, like Harry mentioned in this case, there are different teams and different goals, and everybody just wants to get their thing done. So for sure, maybe it's not always like bad intention. I would say maybe one thing to look at is a bit, actually this was part of your previous colleagues, Rio Akasaka, also from Google, a bit of empathy. So being a product manager is also a lot of influence work, and product managers don't have authority, and that makes it difficult. It's not always possible, as Harry mentioned, to go to the higher management and force commitment. I mean, it's great if that happens, but it's not always possible. So then, as a product manager, I think what one can do is just try to look, okay, what is the interest of the other people, and how can I provide something so they win as well, so this win-win situation. And then when they have an interest in the project, then of course they would dedicate more time and energy to it. So just do this mental exercise. If of course it's not a mean intended person, okay, why isn't this person collaborating or aligning, and what would they need or want, and how can I facilitate that so that they will support me as well?
Yep. Yeah, I mean, Harry's question was excellent. I mean, it's definitely, it's also very frustrating being in that position where if you come up with something and you've done all the right things and your team has been working effectively, then it's kind of out of your control. And that's definitely organization by organization differs in how to potentially improve that process.
Do you think that one thing that could help, taking this down the line also, once a decision's been made, you need to implement on it, put it into action, and it's usually sometimes out of your control, maybe it's someone other team. So could it be effective if, for example, you try to get it included as an OKR, for that other team, or I don't know, talk to their managers, but just some way to help get that the action item to actually be implemented, so it wasn't like the decision was made and then it stalls? Yeah,
I think that's a great idea. I mean, there's depending on how you end up making the decision, implementing it. Yeah, as you said, collaborating with other people, making sure that the idea is prioritized. Even if it's on the OKRs, it needs to be prioritized on their OKRs, similar to how yours are, right? Otherwise, you end up in like passive-aggressive OKR prioritization wars, which is like it can always be fun. So there's the empathy element is also very important. Talking to people at the end of the day, everyone you're probably working with, it's human. If they're being a bad egg, they're doing it for a specific reason. Try and find out what that is. Very different to good decision making, but very important to getting things across the line that are outside your control.
So I think we have time for one last question. Can you tell us about a situation when some ineffective team decision making was happening, and how you were able to, in using these 5 steps, I think from the standpoint of some of the ways that you've learned to help someone from a lessons learned perspective, for someone who's just starting out, or perhaps working with a new team and just trying to help know what to look for when it comes to some ineffective decision.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think the easier way is to go about it is to kind of flag where you see things wrong. I think one main area is when you exclude important people from the decision-making process. I've joined teams where, in one hand, the designers are completely excluded, right? So it's just the engineers and maybe the product manager are involved, and then the designers are it's like treated as an external design studio, just like you do the mocks and that's it. And then that you always create a lot of tension between the two teams, because the designers, don't feel like they're brought in, and then you don't get a lot out. Similarly, I've been in teams where it's the exact opposite. It's like all the designers and PMs get together, they ideate, they're like, this is what the future's going to look like, and you get these like grandiose visions, and they're like, here you go, engineer, go build this, and yeah, you do your thing. And that's actually really bad, especially companies like Google that are very engineering centric. You get really you get a lot of a very abrasive relationship between them. And something really practical to do is think about how you're set up as a team, like physically. So if you're a PM working with engineers and designers, do you all sit together, right? If the PMs and designers sit on the other end of the building and all the engineers sit on the other side, you will naturally end up in a place where the designers and PMs are going to make decisions, and the engineers will think that they're not involved or will make their own decisions, and you'll have this huge clash. So those are like some practical things. If you're like new to a team and you see something, you're like, this doesn't kind of feel right. Why don't we change it? In terms of the actual process, I think when you're going through it for the first time with a new team, you definitely need to kind of take note of all the different personalities and behaviors, and really try and be as neutral as possible initially, so that if they're the next time you can, if you wanted to implement a new process, people can trust you, rather than showing bad behavior on the first time. No one's going to trust you next time. Then on top of that, you want to make sure you take note of the individual's behavior. If some people are really attached to their idea and like are just not letting go, even if it's, irrespective of whether it's a good or bad idea, that's like a red flag. So you know that this person has a certain type of behavior, and you work with them individually. And that's something that I've had to do quite a fair bit, which is individuals who I feel like are hijacking the decision-making process, just isolating them out, and not in a you haven't done this well type of way, but just like giving them a lot of extra love and making sure that whatever issue is kind of bubbling underneath it, that's coming out as like being difficult, that you understand and you can address. And there's often very like fundamental, like everyone generally is just trying to do good, and they're trying to help like either their team, or they're trying to do something which in their mind is good. You just need to understand what that is and then address it. So yeah, a lot of this is, as I said, a lot of it is kind of people related. PMs are very much the glue to a team. So if you are joining a new team, or you do find yourself in a difficult situation, try and make sure you understand where everyone's coming from, how people are aligned together. If there are existing difficulties in relationship, because you can jump into a new team and two people are just bumping heads and you have no context, right? So understanding like the interpersonal dynamics as well. It's nothing against you. It's nothing against the metrics. It's nothing against the 2018 planning that you've been doing. It's just these two people really don't like each other. So, okay, how are you going to solve that problem and make sure that the team comes out with something good on the other side, rather than having a meeting where it's just two people yelling and hating on each other's ideas and everyone's on their laptops because they can't be bothered.
Yes, exactly.
So yeah, that's basically, so use the 5 steps as kind of just a rough guide of, here are some things to make your life easier. But at the end of the day, you want to make sure that like a lot of you're familiar with a lot of the personalities and people who are being involved in this, and then it'll make it much, much easier to go through the process once you kind of know your team well. Right.
That makes sense. We actually are going to squeeze in one more question that just came in through the chat. So Condora asks, I guess you know the Skilled Agile framework.
Yes.
Methodology. Do you have one or several major recommendations, as we're now starting in a big and laggy company with this, out of the perspective of the PM on program level?
Yes. I have so at Google, people ask like, do you use Agile? Do you use this? There's no process that we actually follow. So each team kind of does their own thing. So I'm not sure what's called what. So there's the Agile, which is the lean startup, which is Eric Ries, I think, or I might be confusing them. Unfortunately, I'm not an expert on those areas. Or like the Google process is very much, you have quarterly OKRs, which you can Google it and you can find like Intel, I think, invented the process. So that's definitely a stable part of what every single team does. And that you have annual and quarterly OKRs, and then the decision-making, the really heavy decision-making happens in those OKR planning meetings. Like, what are we going to do next quarter? What's our P0, P1, P2, P3? And then how you achieve those OKRs is completely independent, team by team. So some teams do daily stand-ups, some teams do nothing for, like, just sit in a room for 3 months and don't talk to each other and eventually ship. It just, every team works differently, but the quarterly OKR process and annual OKRs are really where, at least for me personally, 80% of decision making and going through this process happened in the OKR planning. So, check out I forget who wrote the Intel CEO wrote a book. It's really good, goes into this process in detail. So you should check it out.
Thank you. So Nabil, before we wrap up, could you share one kernel of wisdom for everybody here?
Yes, I forgot. I think, yeah, I've gone through it, I guess, a couple of times, but really, as a PM, your main role is to be, depending on the company, your main role is to kind of be the glue between multiple teams and making sure that you've removed all the roadblocks away for people to kind of build and ship. And in the glue part, by being the glue, you need to understand, like, who are the key stakeholders, who are the key decision makers, what are the personality types, and then making sure that when everyone comes together to make these decisions, that you have people trust and have bought in to the process that you're going to be doing. And if you do it, 2-3 times, it might be difficult, but then by the 4th and 5th time, people will understand where you're coming from. And I think the key element is in removing the ego. If you can remove that element, a lot of the interpersonal and political difficulties kind of goes out the window. And then you end up with you have fight, flight, and flow. That's really where you end up with flow.
Thank you very much.
Cool.
So with that, we'll say very much thank you to Nabil for hosting today's session. And thank you to all for joining us today. Please be on the lookout for our recording and summary once it's available. And the next session will be in February 15th with Chris Long at Shopify. Sorry, February 16th with Chris Long at Shopify. We'll go ahead and also provide with that as we schedule the different dates and the speakers. And with that, thank you all for joining us today. And until
I think we can just remind people, because it's a bit difficult maybe to get reminded about the session. So what we do is, like, right now you heard the announcement, it's going to be on the 16th of February. Either way, we're sending out the newsletter. So if you're subscribed to the PMF newsletters, you're going to receive this information. And on the YouTube link, there's a little button with set reminder. So if you want to participate in this session and are just afraid you might forget about it, because I'm sure, like any other product manager, you have your agendas extremely filled. So just click on the set reminder, and you're gonna get the reminder as the session comes along. And if you have suggestions for topics or speakers, we're looking forward to hearing them.
Great. Thank you, everybody. Until next time.
Thank you. Bye.